The uncomfortable truth that the evidence appears to be pointing us toward is that the SEC instructed FINRA, possibly during conversations they had with FINRA's OTC corporate actions team, referenced in this December 2nd email, to include incorrect information in the MMTLP corporate action. Now, before dismissing this as a reach, please consider that this email is from a FINRA principal investigator to redacted SEC recipients, with the subject line specifically Metamaterials, MMTLP, Next Bridge Hydrocarbons. The email makes it clear that he's speaking to at least two people, possibly more, at the SEC. He also includes the fact that FINRA's market fraud investigations team had received several tips that appear to have also been sent to the SEC. The request in the email regarding proposed times to meet appears to correspond to the December 5th email from Dradi, where these same FINRA fraud investigators are now CC'd on the inquiry email thread that Dradi initially responded to from the SEC on November 29, 2021. So, when you observe the December 5th email, and as I've mentioned, Richard Boyle and Jay Gibbon are now CC'd, you get the impression that this was a follow-up to the December 2nd email, where they requested to meet on either Monday or Tuesday. Both of these emails appear to be FINRA's fraud department communicating with their SEC counterparts. But what isn't clear is why the SEC's fraud department would be having conversations with FINRA's OTC corporate actions team at least 4 days before the initial December 6th corporate action. But, with the benefit of hindsight and knowing that FINRA forced Metamaterials to go with the wording and dates that FINRA chose to incorporate, you can't help but get the impression that FINRA and the SEC colluded to sabotage the one-for-one exchange. This would explain why, even though FINRA initiated a blue sheet investigation into both MMAT and MMTLP on December 5th, neither entity saw this as a reason to deem the submission deficient. Instead, we see that the first flawed corporate action was published the following day. The SEC's reverse merger investigation would have naturally led them to suspect a similar scheme, which is baffling in two ways. One, the SEC spent so much time reviewing the multiple amendments which allowed the word to spread about the spin-off, luring in more investors, before they ultimately made it effective. And two, John Berda, George Palikaris and Metamaterials knew they were under investigation. How much sense would it make for them to formulate a scheme involving the MMTLP spin-off, especially since the future of Metamaterials relied on successfully distancing themselves from the oil and gas assets and any controversy? The other thing to consider is that the SEC likely targeted investors as well as the issuers in their efforts to prevent the scheme. News of the charges against the Atlas 8 trading group came ironically on December 14th, the most important day in the spin-off. Yet it didn't even appear in the revised corporate action. Given that the SEC's case against Atlas was this close to the publicizing of the charges, you can't help but think maybe the SEC suspected there was some overlap between them. The Atlas Group had a large social media financial influencer following. Perhaps the SEC was under the impression that the majority of MMTLP holders were followers of the Atlas 8 group. This narrative would have been an easy one for FINRA to get behind, in my opinion. But where's the data to support this theory? From the SEC complaint against the Atlas Group, the members sold Torchlight way sooner and far cheaper than they could have if there was any real coordination between them and the CEOs. If any of them were invested in MMTLP, the SEC hasn't made that public. But we skipped some things. In the video, MMTLP, the SEC Timeline Part 1, I explained how every SEC chair's meetings with FINRA appeared on their public calendar. For the most part, the meetings appeared like this, where the only meeting participant listed was FINRA CEO Robert W. Cook, and in some examples, Chief Legal Officer Robert Colby also appeared as in attendance. This, of course, doesn't mean that it's impossible that there were more participants that weren't listed, specifically staff from the SEC, but when you observe the timing of how the meeting participants in Gary Gensler's FINRA meetings changed, as well as how those participants are linked to MMTLP, then it becomes difficult to dismiss as a mere coincidence. Any attempts to FOIA the minutes of these meetings are automatically denied. But a granted FOIA request about communications surrounding the meeting did result in seeing a redacted version of the subject for the December 23rd meeting with FINRA. This would have been the first meeting between Gary Gensler and FINRA, according to his public calendar, that occurred after the U3 halt of MMTLP, after the email from Robert W. Cook to the SEC concerning threats received related to the U3 halt, and after the December 12th meeting between FINRA and high-level SEC employees from the Division of Trading and Markets, directly before the deletion of the MMTLP trading symbol would have permanently created a roadblock for facilitating orderly settlement. So what was in the subject line? FINRA leadership meeting with Chair Gensler, redacted. And when you look at the size of the redacted box, you notice that it's about the size of a single word, or better yet, one or two trading symbols. Why else would they redact this portion of the subject line? They obviously don't want people to know that the meeting was about MMTLP. And when you look at the meeting participants, and when you go back to when they started meeting and how many times this same core group met with Gensler, you can easily piece together the fact that they've been discussing MMTLP together for a very long time. There's a short video titled 12-12-22 that covers the meeting between FINRA and the SEC on December 12, 2022. We'll briefly cover it here along with an important detail that was left out. When you understand the timing and weight of the decisions that most likely resulted from this meeting, it becomes more difficult to not see a connection between the participants and their attendance at the Gary Gensler meetings with FINRA. On the day before FINRA's planned deletion of the MMTLP trading symbol, there was a very important meeting between key figures from FINRA and the SEC. The presence of these individuals from the legal, policy, operational, and oversight departments of both organizations underscored the seriousness with which the MMTLP situation was being handled at the highest levels. The FINRA participants were Stephanie Dumont, Executive Vice President of Market Regulation and Transparency Services. Her role is central to overseeing market conduct and trading activity. Raquel Russell, Senior Vice President and Director of Capital Markets. Her presence, along with the Transparency Services team, underscored the meeting's focus on the technical and operational aspects of the trading halt. Ola Persson, Senior Vice President of Transparency Services. He was the superior of Patricia Kazimatis, whom we know as likely the first FINRA employee to contact the SEC concerning MMTLP. Person's attendance highlighted the operational and logistical challenges of the corporate action. Chris Stone, Vice President of Equity and Debt Capital Markets Business Head within the Transparency Services Department. Stone is also a FINRA liaison to the UPC committee that many believe made the decision to U3 halt trading. His presence in the meeting was likely to provide crucial operational and technical expertise. This might have included updates on data, outstanding positions, and logistical issues. Interestingly enough, from a 2018 SEC roundtable, Stone explained that halts under FINRA's Rule 6440 were a last resort, and that FINRA's 211 process and their Rule 6490 were buffers before reaching that point. Robert L.D. Colby, Executive Vice President and Chief Legal Officer. Colby's involvement would have been vital for assessing and mitigating the legal risks associated with the decision to halt trading the way they did. Colby would also later become the main contact between FINRA and NextBridge Hydrocarbons. From the original granted FOIA, we learned that Dumont requested to meet with a redacted SEC contact, whom we were later able to identify as David Shillman, thanks to another granted FOIA request more than 2 years later. The meeting, according to the original email, was to provide an update on MMTLP and the recent trading halt. The SEC participants were David Shillman, Associate Director of the Division of Trading and Markets, a key figure in policy and oversight for the US equity market. Dumont would have been contacting Shillman to ensure regulatory coordination and to potentially get the SEC's approval or guidance on FINRA's actions. Shillman agreed to Dumont's request to meet, but he insisted that David and Mark also be involved. David Saltiel, Deputy Director of the Division of Trading and Markets. His presence at the meeting signified the highest level of regulatory oversight, suggesting that the MMTLP situation had market-wide and systemic implications that went beyond a simple procedural matter. He was likely involved in the review and potential approval of the final course of action. Mark J. Donoghue, Senior Policy Advisor in the Division of Trading and Markets. His participation indicated a focus on the legal risks and policy implications of the decision, including the potential consequences for future corporate actions and in preparing for the expected legal challenges. The MMTLP community's own Curtis was keen to recognise the absence of the SEC's Assistant Director for the Office of Clearance and Settlement, Jeffrey Mooney. If the SEC and FINRA were to ever claim that the objective of the December 12th meeting was to genuinely address and solve the impending settlement and clearance problem, the SEC's foremost expert on that topic would have been the most critical person in attendance. His absence strongly suggests that their goal wasn't to find a solution. We can also draw this conclusion based on how things turned out. Instead, it indicates the decision had already been made to contain the crisis by keeping trading halted indefinitely. The meeting was likely focused on the legal and operational mechanics of the halt itself, the how, rather than finding a way to facilitate a proper settlement for everyone involved. This reinforces the idea that the regulators chose to sacrifice a single security and its shareholders to protect the broader system from the consequences of a massive settlement failure. The way FINRA denied the RushNet spin-off shortly after, due to missing filings from more than 20 years prior, further reinforces the idea that FINRA and the SEC have a pattern of sacrificing select investors under false pretense. In case you haven't watched, the case against the Securities Exchange Commission Part 2.5 out of 5, when FINRA denied RushNet, the SEC was 4 years into reviewing a FINRA corporate action denial, very similar to RushNet. By not allowing the RushNet spin-off to proceed, it likely contributed to their subsidiary Helios DX filing for bankruptcy just 5 months later, as well as the negative impact it had on RushNet and their shareholders. And if it were to be argued that the precedent was yet to be set regarding the SEC's review of FINRA's deficiency determinations based solely on missing filings, you have to keep in mind that the SEC would have been on high alert concerning how FINRA processed spin-off corporate actions after the U3 halt of the MMTLP spin-off. All 5 SEC commissioners at the time were involved with that particular review, and at the time of the RushNet denial, they were 4 years into that review. To think that the SEC wouldn't notice that FINRA denied the RushNet spin-off for the same reason all 5 commissioners at the SEC were reviewing, and would eventually rule against FINRA for, is difficult to believe. But let's get back to MMTLP. The evidence of the SEC being aware of an issue since at least November 2021, to being in conversations with FINRA's fraud department leading up to and the day before the first corporate action was published, to having this extremely high-level meeting on the final day before symbol deletion effectively trapping holders of MMTLP and their liquidity in an investment against their will, it's difficult to understand why Gary Gensler told Senator Crapo that FINRA didn't consult the SEC concerning their decision to halt trading. This was September 2023 when Gensler said this, 9 months after the U3 halt. The controversy surrounding MMTLP was one of, if not the biggest issue related to the market since the halt. Gensler adopted a highly defensive and evasive communication strategy when responding to questions concerning MMTLP. His verbal tactics appear to be designed to create distance and deflect responsibility, while his non-verbal cues point to discomfort and a lack of confidence. He systematically refused to confirm or deny any specific investigation into MMTLP. He repeatedly uses institutional phrases like, "We don't speak to specific investigations," and "I can't speak about specific possible investigations" as a shield. This is a classic media-trained tactic to shut down a line of questioning without appearing to lie. A key part of his strategy was to emphasize the regulatory separation between the SEC and FINRA. By stating FINRA is separate from the SEC and that the halt was done under FINRA's rules without seeking SEC advice or permission, he verbally builds a wall to insulate his agency from direct responsibility for the controversial decision. Then, when pressed on oversight, Gensler retreated to vague, general statements about the SEC's role. He mentioned that the SEC examines FINRA annually and regularly, but deliberately avoids applying this to the specific MMTLP case, leaving his answer technically true but unhelpfully broad. Then there's the use of filler words like and qualifying phrases such as "I think" when discussing the frequency of FINRA examinations, which can be interpreted as signs of cognitive load. Basically, he appeared to be thinking carefully about what to say and what not to say. He framed the lack of transparency as a matter of legal procedure, stating that information only becomes public if we either settle or bring charges. The aim was to portray his silence not as a choice, but as a legal constraint, which was yet another defensive maneuver. So let's go further down this rabbit hole. On December 22, 2023, 70-plus members of Congress, including Ralph Norman and Pete Sessions, sent an open letter to Gary Gensler, the then chair of the SEC, and Robert W. Cook, president and CEO of FINRA. The main point of the open letter was to formally request that the SEC and FINRA conduct a thorough review of the events surrounding the trading of the metamaterials Series A preferred shares, MMTLP. The letter was a direct response to receiving over 40,000 letters from concerned investors. The core issues driving the request were constituent concerns about the circumstances surrounding the U3 trading halt of MMTLP on December 9, 2022, and the level of short selling in the security. To address the concerns, the letter demanded a comprehensive response by January 31, 2024, and posed 16 detailed questions seeking a full timeline, legal justifications for the halt, unredacted communications, data on share counts, and any evidence of fraud, manipulation, or insider trading. The stated goal was to ensure transparency, dispel misinformation, and properly safeguard investors. Robert Cook barely met the deadline to respond, and Gary Gensler's response came 6 days after the deadline. In a post on X, Norman referred to the response as worthless and completely unacceptable. Cook's response was 32 pages, but about half of it was the inclusion of the November 6, 2023 supplemental FAQ twice. It appears he accidentally or intentionally didn't include the March 16, 2023 FAQ. The response mostly regurgitates the lies FINRA pushed in their FAQs, but there's also an obvious effort to demonize NextBridge Hydrocarbons for not taking the steps necessary to make the NextBridge shares tradable in order to address the small amount of short interest that FINRA claimed to exist. It's important to note that in a letter from NextBridge Hydrocarbons to FINRA dated January 23, 2024, Greg McCabe, chairman and CEO of NextBridge Hydrocarbons, had this to say to FINRA's Executive Vice President and Chief Legal Officer, Robert Colby. Per your request, the investment banking firm, representing NextBridge on our proposed S1, has received several inbound calls from financial institutions needing to buy our shares to get their books in balance. One of the inquiries was of a size so large that I requested to be on a call with this group. From this call, I now have knowledge of an admitted shareholder imbalance from one single financial institution that is multiples more than 2.65 million shares. We continue to collect additional data regarding imbalances from multiple sources. There is a significant disconnect between our growing data and FINRA's stated number of 2.65 million shares of outstanding short interest. I believe this highlights the need for a more exhaustive review of the total shares in all accounts and through all categories of security, long or short, onshore or offshore, and by parties registered with FINRA or not. The ultimate goal of this investigation is to make sure that every shareholder who purchased a share of MMTLP has the corresponding one-for-one share of NextBridge Hydrocarbons. Furthermore, any party that sold shares short of MMTLP or was short Torchlight Energy and carried that short position through the merger with Metamaterials and for whatever reason has not provided the corresponding sold share to the rightful owner needs to consummate the final step of the short transaction and purchase those shares they sold without a borrow and deliver them to the rightful owners. The 2.65 million shares of outstanding short interest he's referring to came from FINRA's November 6, 2023, supplemental FAQ. This January 23, 2024, letter informed FINRA that their estimate was clearly inaccurate by a substantial amount. The letter from Robert W. Cook to Norman and 70-plus members of Congress was dated January 31, 2024, just 8 days after the letter from Nextbridge Hydrocarbons. In Cook's letter, he never mentions the inconsistency between FINRA's 2.65 million estimate and the claim from Greg McCabe that his company received requests to solve imbalances beyond their estimate. This is highly suspicious, and it raises serious questions about FINRA's motives, the integrity of their data, and their commitment to market transparency. The letter from Nextbridge is a critical piece of evidence. It's not just a claim from a retail investor. It's a formal communication from the company itself to its regulator. The company's assertion that its own data suggests a number considerably higher than the 2.65 million shares is a direct contradiction of FINRA's public-facing information. This letter placed a direct obligation on FINRA and its leadership. As a self-regulatory organization, FINRA's mission is to protect investors and ensure market integrity. When a company's CEO provides such specific and damning information, it should trigger an immediate and serious investigation, not be ignored in a subsequent public statement to Congress. Again, there were 8 full days in between the Nextbridge Hydrocarbons letter to FINRA and the Robert W. Cook response to Congress. Even if we were to believe that Cook didn't get the information in time, the information should have still warranted addressing this disconnect. We're now approaching 2 years since the November 6, 2023 supplemental FAQ, and FINRA has been content all this time with allowing this misinformation to flourish. And as for the validity of the Nextbridge letter, CEOs and other corporate officers are held to a very high standard. Lying to regulators like the SEC or FINRA is a serious offence with significant penalties. Providing false or misleading information to a regulator can lead to civil or even criminal charges for securities fraud, perjury, and obstruction of justice. The SEC and other regulators can impose substantial monetary fines and order the disgorgement of any profits made from the fraudulent activity. Individuals found to have lied to regulators can be barred from working in the securities industry. This principle is a cornerstone of market regulation. The integrity of the system depends on the honesty and accuracy of the information provided by market participants. Yet time after time, especially in the case of MMTLP, it's the regulators that are continually caught in lies but face no consequences. And isn't it convenient that trades on December 8th weren't subject to CNS settlement? This move and the subsequent justifications provided by FINRA and Robert W. Cook raise serious questions about transparency and market integrity. Both MMTLP corporate actions clearly stated that purchases of MMTLP executed after December 8th wouldn't receive the distribution. This established December 8th as the final day for long positions to be opened and still be entitled to receive the new security. In response to this, brokerages correctly informed their clients that trading after this date would be for closing transactions only. This would have allowed long holders who did not want to receive the non-tradable Nextbridge shares to exit their positions for cash. This would have provided them with a clear and transparent off-ramp. It would have provided a final, public and transparent opportunity for short sellers to cover their positions. The trading activity during this period would have been a direct measure of the supply and demand for shares. A surge in price and volume would have been a strong indicator of a significant short interest trying to cover. But by issuing the U3 halt and preventing the closing transactions only trading period from ever occurring, FINRA denied both sides of the market this final critical opportunity and also forced the involvement of multiple brokerages that had policies against allowing their clients to hold private, non-tradable securities. Long position holders that wanted to sell are now left with no way to exit their position in that specific public market scenario where short position holders would have needed to close their positions or be forced liquidated. At the time of the halt, FINRA downplayed the idea that the U3 halt was initiated to protect short sellers and the idea of there being significant short interest. But based on the evidence, specifically what we addressed in the case against the Securities Exchange Commission Part 1 of 5. The most plausible assessment is that FINRA's actions, while ostensibly for investor protection, had the primary effect of mitigating the risk for short position holders. Protection of short positions. In a scenario where short sellers are forced to cover their positions, the demand for the security would skyrocket, leading to a short squeeze and a massive price spike. This would have been a significant financial loss for those holding short positions. By halting trading and preventing these positions from being force liquidated or closed, FINRA effectively protected this segment of the market. Contradictory justification. The stated reason for the halt, protecting buyers from a worthless security, is undermined by two key facts. Closing-only transactions. Multiple messages from multiple brokerages proved that they already restricted trading to closing transactions, meaning no new investors could buy into the MMTLP after December 8th. Nullification authority. FINRA had a less disruptive tool, their Rule 11893, to address any potential erroneous trades, making a full halt seem like using a sledgehammer to push in a thumbtack. Ignoring the imbalance. Short positions weren't closed. There's an imbalance attempting to be transferred to a private, non-tradable security, which points to a serious market integrity issue. A public company action should not result in an unresolved short interest being moved to a non-tradable private security. This creates a potentially unfixable liability for the brokers that facilitated the short positions and leaves the long position holders with no viable way to exit their investment. FINRA's assertion from their initial FAQ that the corporate action didn't compel short positions to be closed, but rather that the positions in MMTLP would be adjusted to an equal short position in NextBridge was flawed. Multiple messages from brokerages to their clients indicated that short positions in MMTLP did in fact need to be closed out. A message from Trade Zero America explicitly stated that short positions in MMTLP needed to be liquidated by 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday, December 9, 2022, and that failure to do so would result in the firm automatically liquidating the position. This directly contradicts FINRA's claim. E-Trade responded to a client on December 3rd, asking about how MMTLP short positions would be handled, leading into the spin-off. In the response, E-Trade informed the client that they don't allow customers to hold securities in private markets. This aligns with a need for MMTLP short position holders to close out their positions before the completion of the spin-off. A message from Interactive Brokers with the header, Metamaterials, MMTLP, pending liquidations, was basically a notice telling clients to close their short positions or else face liquidation. Fidelity, Charles Schwab and TD Ameritrade didn't mention forced liquidations, but they did inform their clients that trading in MMTLP after December 8th would be limited to closing transactions only, which contradicts FINRA's claim that investors needed to be protected from buying MMTLP after December 8th. Given the widespread distribution of these messages across major brokerage firms, it is highly improbable that FINRA was unaware. FINRA's decision to ignore these messages suggests a regulatory pattern that, despite being framed as investor protection, effectively prioritized the stability of the system and the interests of short position holders over the rights of long investors who intended to sell before privatization. The timing of the intervention, the decision to halt trading rather than employ less disruptive remedies, and the resultant unresolved short interest collectively point to a deliberate regulatory maneuver intended to prevent a significant, market-driven short squeeze. By understanding the distinct authorities within FINRA, it becomes clear that the widely held belief within the MMTLP community that the UPC subcommittee initiated the U3 halt is likely incorrect. In accordance with FINRA Rule 6440, a halt like the U3 is typically the responsibility of the operations or market regulation departments. The UPC subcommittee's formal role is to issue rulings and interpretations of the Uniform Practice Code and to hear and make decisions regarding certain appeals. If the subcommittee had been involved, the official notice regarding the MMTLP halt would have been an explicit UPC ruling, which it was not. FINRA operations, or FINRA market operations. This would likely have been the primary department responsible for processing corporate actions, implementing trading halts, and communicating operational instructions via the UPC advisory system. The operations and systems listed in the header of the notice directly points to the staff responsible for executing the halt and sending the notice. The bottom of the notice also directs questions to FINRA market operations. Those involved would have likely been aware that their actions could be detrimental to retail investors. Furthermore, FINRA's justification for the halt is contradicted by the precedent set in the Kit Digital case. Corporate Actions Specialist Stephen Paul Dapsich, a long-time UPC committee member, would have been particularly aware of this precedent and the fact that both MMTLP corporate actions provided sufficient information to avoid the shortcomings associated with that case. One of the reasons that the UPC committee appeared to be responsible for initiating the U3 halt is that several members at the time represented firms that held liabilities in MMTLP. So if the UPC committee at the time was in fact responsible in some way for the halt notice, this might explain their reluctance to speak up concerning a clear abuse of authority. And what should add to the suspicion is the mass exodus of UPC committee members right after the U3 halt. Particularly Dapsich, who appears to have centered his entire career around corporate actions, as well as devoting numerous years to serving on FINRA's UPC committee, dating back to 2015. The root issue here is that there's been a failure to adhere to the Uniform Practice Code, or whatever the equivalent term is, for describing FINRA's obligation to conduct themselves with uniformity. The UPC Code is a set of rules and guidelines designed to standardize the operational and settlement procedures for transactions between FINRA's member firms, but shouldn't it also extend to FINRA? When there's a failure to properly administer and interpret the Uniform Practice Code, the result is a failure or inefficient attempt to process securities transactions. A clear, common set of rules helps prevent the types of disputes and misunderstandings that we've seen as a result of the MMTLP fiasco. FINRA leans heavily on the idea that the spin-off was complicated, but the uncertainty and the lack of uniformity were a direct result of FINRA's insistence on doing things in a way that would never be close to being considered uniform practice. Take the creation of the MMTLP corporate actions, for example. The argument can easily be made that it's uniform practice for the issuer to have the final say concerning the dates relating to important details in their corporate action, especially if they were consistent with what the SEC made effective. But this isn't what FINRA did when they informed Metamaterials that they had to proceed with the corporate action created by FINRA. The December 6th MMTLP corporate action had an overall effective date of December 13th, the 0 hour. This was 40 hours earlier than the planned one-for-one exchange that would result in cancellation of the MMTLP shares. The December 6th corporate action also included a share cancellation date effective December 13th, aligning with the overall effective date of the corporate action. Then, on December 8th, FINRA claims that they clarified their intention of actually including MMTLP symbol deletion, effective December 13th. This too aligned with the overall effective date of December 13th, the 0 hour, 40 hours before the planned one-for-one exchange and share cancellation. From a strict uniform practice and market efficiency perspective, there is generally no practical benefit to deleting a symbol 40 hours early, especially if trading was already halted. In a textbook scenario, the symbol deletion would occur on or after the corporate action's true effective date to formally remove the security from the market's quotation systems once it was legally defunct. However, according to FINRA, their reasoning for deleting the symbol effective December 13th, 2022, 40 hours before the planned one-for-one exchange and share cancellation of MMTLP, was allegedly an extension of their decision to halt trading on December 9th. By deleting the symbol effective December 13th, FINRA definitively shut down any possibility of trading, quoting, or order entry on the OTC system before the official cancellation date. The trading halt was a temporary measure to stop activity, Symbol deletion was the final administrative step to remove a security from the daily list of tradable symbols. This move formalized the security's exit from the public trading environment. This is a sound argument, but let me show you how it all falls apart. FINRA's arguments can only hold weight if their corporate actions were legitimate. Due to their selective enforcement of deficiency rules, they were not. FINRA's Rule 6490 grants them the discretionary power to refuse to process a corporate action request if certain deficiency factors are met, including pending adjudication and/or investigations. FINRA may deem a request deficient if it has actual knowledge that parties related to the company-related action are the subject of pending, adjudicated or settled regulatory action or investigation by a regulatory body related to fraud or securities violations. Also, if state, federal or foreign authority or self-regulatory organization has provided information to FINRA, or FINRA otherwise has actual knowledge indicating that the issuer, associated persons, officers, directors, or other persons connected with the issuer or the corporate action, may be potentially involved in fraudulent activities related to the securities markets and/or pose a threat to public investors. The former CEOs of Torchlight and Metamaterials, in addition to Metamaterials, were subject to an SEC subpoena in September 2021. While the SEC didn't file charges until June 2024, the mere existence of the formal investigation would typically fall under the scope of Rule 6490 for increased scrutiny or rejection. FINRA's Market Fraud Investigation Team initiated a blue sheet investigation into both MMAT and MMTLP on December 5, 2022. This occurred one day before the first public corporate action was published on December 6th, and only 3 days before the revision on December 8th. This internal knowledge of a fraud/manipulation investigation provided a clear, existing ground under Rule 6490 to deem the entire corporate action filing deficient and delay processing until the investigation was complete. Instead of rejecting or delaying the process based on these red flags, which would have protected the entire market by forcing a pause, FINRA chose to move forward with the corporate action, while simultaneously embedding their own terms that would then be used to justify halting trading. FINRA is a self-regulatory organization whose role in OTC corporate actions is primarily ministerial, to review the company's submitted notice and either publish it or deem it deficient, not to unilaterally dictate its terms. The controversial language and focus, specifically the inclusion of an incorrect share cancellation date, followed by a symbol deletion date aligning with the overall effective date of the corporate action, was provided to Metamaterials by FINRA's corporate action team. Then, on December 8, 2022, FINRA unilaterally revised the language again without input from the issuer, after having a discussion with the DTCC, Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, to which the issuer's counsel was not invited. This sequence shows FINRA doing 3 things that contradicts their stated role. 1. Writing the corporate action language. 2. Excluding the issuer from key discussions with the DTCC. And 3. Unilaterally revising the corporate action without issuer authorization. These documented actions suggest FINRA moved aggressively beyond their regulatory scope. FINRA's official justification for the halt and the early deletion of the MMTLP trading symbol was clearance and settlement concerns. However, the fact that FINRA simultaneously ignored valid reasons to reject the corporate action submission, the fraud investigation and the SEC subpoena/pending adjudication, and then seized control of the language, dates and focus of the corporate action suggests a different priority. A coordinated effort to administratively contain the financial risk associated with a massive potential short squeeze, even if it meant financially harming the issuer and the investors that held MMTLP. This selective application of FINRA's rules is central to the claims that their actions undermined their mandate to protect investors and maintain a fair and orderly market. The SEC's silence concerning FINRA's actions, combined with the timing of filing charges against the former CEOs at the peak of the community's congressional support, easily suggests that the SEC is running interference in an attempt to take the heat off of FINRA and the SEC. This isn't just a theory. A granted FOIA request has revealed that the SEC was in direct communication with Rep. Ralph Norman's staff before the charges against the former CEOs were even filed. This, of course, is in direct contradiction to Gary Gensler's claims, which makes it that much more suspicious that his text messages were conveniently wiped. This seems like a good stopping point. Let's save some for the next installments of MMTLP, the case against the Securities Exchange Commission.